No, have I got him here? No. No? Oh, no.
He's not alive.
No. Well, the only other thing I can tell you, I was going to explain about what's going to happen up here, but you might be able to help on that.
Really a bit concerning.
Just a bit of detail, not really detail. We,
You would have seen that downstairs, wouldn't you? Museum collection.
can I just introduce Bernard first? You don't know the background of Bernard. He was the chairman of the Camberley Natural History Society, of which Jenny and I and the others are members. He was the chairman forever, and the president, who should be here today, has been there forever. But we had to disband the society at the end of COVID because of lack of cash in a way to buy to rent the premises and driving and stuff. And so we ended up where we are now. But Bernard, with his total, he's Mr. Nature. Anything you need to know about natural history, he's your man. He's a tree warden, one of the tree wardens for the borough.
We've been out doing planting trees this morning. They cancelled just because it was a bit of a threat.
Yeah.
Softies, aren't they?
I've been out with him emptying bat boxes. He was the, I don't know if he still kind of classifies himself, is what they call the Batman of the area. You've got a bat in your belfry, he's the one that came out to remove it and put it back safely to where it belongs. I've been on walks with him, I've been snake watching, finding and watching and photographing. There's nothing he doesn't know about nature. I can't sort of keep on boosting
He's a
him now,
walking
but
encyclopedia.
he's a walking encyclopedia on that subject. But Bernard also has an interest in taxidermy, which is Pat's speciality. So Bernard, over to you.
My interest is in anything natural history really. So obviously, when you're out and about, you collect bits and pieces, and then when you're at fairs and all the rest, you find bits of taxidermy. And in 20 years ago, you could go to little antique fairs and pick up all sorts of bits and pieces. Nowadays, a bit like since Damien Hirst started calling taxidermy art, and it got popular again. In the Victorian times, every family had taxidermy, and then it went out of fashion. You could pick them up for next to nothing, and now they get ridiculous prices. But Pat, unfortunately, he will come and give you a talk and tell you about one particular taxidermist, but he is like the country's authority on taxidermy. If DEFRA have got a query about a piece of taxidermy, whether it's legal, it's an endangered species, whether it's a new taxidermy item, whether it's a historic taxidermy item, Pat will go along and tell them and confirm whether it is or not. And it's a very subtle difference. You can get the taxidermy animal, and obviously you've got the furry animal outside, but then modern ones are generally made on a big cast. The easiest way to make a taxidermy animal is to skin an animal, put it over a mould, sew it up. But in the old days they didn't do that, and if Pat does a proper talk about how taxidermy works, he'll show you how they used to make them with the metal frames and wood wool and make them, and so you can tell the difference. And I've got a nice otter at home, and you get hold of its back and you can feel it, and it's sort of squidgy, whereas modern ones aren't like that. So anyway,
Any of the bone structure at all?
skulls, and yes, and sometimes they do full skeletons, other times all the skeletons disappear, because there's no reason to keep. If you do taxidermy birds, you just keep the legs, put wires up through the legs, and the whole of the body is just on a frame. But they keep the skull, because the skull usually is a little bit tricky. And the problem with the skull is once it's dead, an animal, the flesh, you don't want all the flesh underneath it, so you have to clean that flesh out. So you have to replace that with soft clay and then you can mould it and make it look natural. And this is a wild dog. And the talk today is supposed to be about Van Ingen. Van Ingen factory was a massive factory in India. It was the largest taxidermy firm in the world. And it was when there were lots and lots of tigers, all sorts of animals, and people were trying to get rid of tigers because they got fed up of eating all the farmers that were trying to farm the fields, and the Indian population increased. So obviously there was a lot of conflict, so the people were killing tigers all over the place. But the British were out there, and the Maharajas and all the rest, they invite them out and they do shooting parties, and they were just, they go out for a shooting party and come back with half a dozen dead tigers. And most of those went to Van Ingen's. And Van Ingen's, mostly, they're on big wooden shields like this, black like that. And they've all got, this one's actually got the label, because that one's missing, Van Ingen, and then they have a number on the back. And Pat's got all the logbooks of all the copies of all the logbooks, because they were big. So we photographed every page of every logbook for all of the time that Van Ingen were making heads. So this one turned up in the museum. After we had done the inventory, we were doing the inventory for the museum collection, and I was doing all the natural history items and logging them all in. But this was only found recently in a box in the back of the cupboard, and it wasn't in a part of that numbers that we were putting in. So this one hasn't been checked, but it's got a number on here, and we know what the species is, and hopefully with the logbooks we can tell who ordered this from Van Ingen's, the person who shot it, what day it was done, and everything else about it. And we've got the information on this one, which Jill was just looking for, and frustratingly she couldn't find it. She thought she'd left it, the information attached to the item, but it's not. So we'll find out about that. But yeah, I mean, that's, I never go good with the years and that. But that's quite a good specimen, although the ears are getting a bit floppy and fragile.
Hannah, forgive me if I missed it because I was out. So that's an African wild dog.
No, it'll be an Indian wild dog. Probably an Indian wild dog. Yeah. Most of the Van Ingen stuff was shot in the Indian continents and that.
Bring them in from elsewhere.
Because, if you had taxidermy from Africa, it mostly went to British taxidermists. What's the big one there?
This is Nairobi or South Africa.
Yeah, that just shows you how useless I am remembering names. There's a very good big British taxidermist. But Pat's collection of taxidermy is all historical, in as much as they're different taxidermists, some very, very skillful, but a whole range of people that used to do taxidermy, and it's nothing to do with particularly the specimen, it's more to do with the person who did the work in it. So Van Ingen, there are people that just collect Van Ingens, so these things becoming very, very expensive. These turn up on the open market.
But are we right in saying that it's closed down now? That's why Pat went down.
It was closing down when he first went. He went a number of years ago, must be 10, 15 years, when he first went. And then over a period of time he went in different years, and the old man was still alive, very fragile. And the factory, because it had closed, and no one did anything with it, there were all the bits and pieces lying around. So the idea of having a table here was because Pat was going to bring stuff. And as well, and because he does have these, because they were doing so many of these animals, you can imagine if you are doing, dozens of leopards every day, they'd be doing more leopards. They didn't want to have to mould the head individually, so they would make one mould of a head, and then they would make a plaster cast of that metal mould, and all their leopards would be almost the same. Although one of
Can
the
I ask where this was? Where it was situated?
Mysore, I think,
Huh?
near Mysore. I think it was near Mysore in India.
Oh, because the name implied it might have been sort of Holland.
Oh yeah, that's just
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
in India.
no. It's definitely, but
Is that from?
Van Ingen Mysore. It's actually written on the green press on the back here. But what you could do, and other taxidermists did as well, particularly in this country where they were doing taxidermy foxes, because foxes were very popular to chase and kill. They would make moulds in different. They would have foxes with their mouths closed, foxes with those horrible gnarly shapes, but they would all be individual moulds, and you could just order what you wanted your fox to look like. So all that is, it's quite a fascinating thing, and tax collection is second to none really for that. And you go in, there's like a wall like that, and that will have about 3 or 4 dozen different fox heads, all different.
Up the stairs, on the landing, every wall which I was
Yeah.
actually
Is that
doing.
in his house?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's
It's spooky. It's spooky.
I mean, it does have a living room. It's got taxidermy in it, in as much as the Victorians used to make fire screens, and they would have lots of little colourful birds, all the little hummingbirds and things that were collected, because the millinery trade used to, the millinery trade was massive, and all the Victorians with the fancy feathery hats, and that was a massive market, in as much as they would kill birds abroad, send them all back to the milliners trade, and actually one of the things I've got at home is a big box of milliners, and it's got birds of paradise in there. I've got quite a few blue pigeon things loads of different birds, and that was what started the RSPB. It was the ladies that were trying to fight against the millinery trade of using birds, and it led to the start of the RSPB. So people were concerned about the waste and everything like killing birds.
You still do see peacock feathers in craft shops.
Yeah, well, peacock feathers are all right, because basically you don't go around shooting peacocks and pulling their feathers out, but every year feathers are molted anyway. So, if you went to Bird World, you were told not to be picking up peacock feathers because they wanted to pick them up themselves and sell them in the shop. But the birds, the interesting thing with the birds, of course, is that you could harvest feathers from birds, but basically that was too much like hard work really, because you had to wait for them to molt. And the egret feathers, which are these fine feathers that they used to have in hats a lot, the egrets only have those feathers in the breeding season. So of course they went shooting egrets in the breeding season, and that's it was just destroying populations really, and all the very exotic birds like in the jungles, birds of paradise and all the rest. In the native people, but with in New Guinea and all that, they would use bows and arrows obviously when they were hunting for birds, because they used to use bird plumes a lot in New Guinea, and all really decorative. But what they used to use was arrows with a big cushioning bit on the end, and it just knocked the bird out of the tree. And so they caught the bird, took the feathers, let the bird go, and then next season they'll have some more feathers.
Feathers.
But obviously, when the white man went out there,
Yeah.
he just took his shotgun and shot them all, and came and sent them back over here. And the interesting thing with birds of paradise, because they were called birds of paradise, because when they came back to Europe and they were all boxed up, and they had no legs, and they looked at these birds and they thought, how on earth can they fly around? And they thought they were something to do with living in paradise, and they didn't need feet, so they didn't have to walk around and climb about in trees. And it turns out that the reason they didn't have any legs was because when they birds of paradise, they're very attractive big birds. They're sort of blackbird size and up, so they're not massive, but they've got huge, great big feet. And because they like to climb out in the trees and that, and so relative to their size, they got big feet. And of course, if you're packing lots of birds in a little container, you want them all nice and soft and close together. So they chopped all the legs off. So all the birds that came over here, they thought they never landed. They just flew around. So that's all a bit weird, really, isn't it?
I saw a programme, in fact I've seen it twice, about Iceland and the eider ducks.
Yeah.
And there was one particular man, and he used to wait for them to build their nests and lay the eggs, go and take a lot of the under feathers that they have to line their nest and replace it with hay or straw. But now he's decided, and I think he still does that a bit, but he's decided to breed eider ducks. So he takes an egg instead and hatches it out. And he keeps these ducks tamed for about a year and then lets them go so that they can build the nests for him to take the eider fluff, which we used to have in our eider downs.
Well, exactly. And that's the thing, if you do it carefully and just take a small amount, and it's how the natives used to work.
Yeah.
But of course, we came in there with, like the Americans shoot all the buffalo, and it's just what they do. And Americans, it seems impossible that they wiped out passenger pigeon in America. I mean, that was literally, skies were black with millions of birds migrating. All the descriptions of it, the sky blackening with the birds flying across, and it was like millions and millions of birds every year migrating across America.
And all we see is the murmuration of starlings.
And then, it would have been phenomenal. And they just went in and just carried on shooting masses off them.
Cyprus.
But
They shoot everything, don't they?
They shoot an awful lot, and they still feed, eat these tiny birds, our birds as well. Really.
Is there any legislation like we have now for, say, ivory, and you can sell ivory goods provided it's over a certain age and you can't do it?
1940s.
So if there's species within the taxidermy world that are rare, is there any legislation that says you don't shoot anymore?
Yeah, well, quite. I mean, there's lots of things you can't sell, and things like tigers, because one of the things Pat's got on his upstairs landing is a big tiger rug. That's a Van Engel one as well. But you can't sell them. You could give it to an educational place or a museum or something, or you could technically give it away, but you're not allowed to sell it. Because and it's the same even with tigers' teeth and claws and things like that. And there's certain species that you're not allowed to trade at all, and quite a lot you can trade as long as they're pre-1947. and which was just a random cut-off date that someone did it, and that's when you've got to be able to prove that you've got an old specimen, not a new one. And people can do taxidermy nowadays. There are taxidermists, obviously, because it became a bit more popular. There's a girl that calls herself the ethical taxidermist, and you know, you get rodent kill and cats killing animals and all sorts of bits and pieces, and zoo animals that die. You know, they can be used in taxidermy, and yeah, some of it's all a bit arty-farty, like Damien Hirst, you know, and that's a bit of nonsense. And yeah, you put one of the best taxidermy artists, as it was, one of the really young, is the one in Banbury in Sussex, and he did taxidermy scenes where, you know, you would have a cat, or it was one of them's rats. They're all playing cards.
Oh,
And then there's a kitten's tea party and all those. And,
That's got that diorama, but the
oh yeah, well the biggest
diorama, yeah.
the biggest diorama is the death of Cock Robin, and it was always on display down there. It's a big cabinet from that sort of order here, and it's got all this taxidermy of the diorama of the death of Cock Robin. And there's a sparrow with a bow and arrow.
just to tell you a little light-hearted thing. Man, I was on holiday down the West Country. We found this restaurant, and it was lovely. The food. We went in, and there was all this taxidermy on the walls and on the sideboards. So we did take her mum and dad down that way at one time, and not thinking, we said, "Oh, we're going to the restaurant." Walked in, and her mum said, "I'm not eating here." She'll end up on the wall or something.
Well, years ago, here in the museum, or maybe next door when we were there, we had a display of taxidermy in the front window.
Yeah.
And there were a few objections at the time.
Well,
But
you had
this
to put the
is quite dark
explanation
in
of how
this
they
place
were.
as well, so that added to the atmosphere.
Lights behind the eyes.
Well, yeah.
Well, yeah, it's a difficult subject really, because you know, most of the taxidermy is really old stuff, and it wasn't the taxidermy, it wasn't the taxidermists that were destroying. Right.
Don't let me interrupt.
No, I've given up, Pat. I've
Just
just
go
been
to
waddling on about taxidermy.
I mean, I don't know whether you want to stay now or what should we do?
Yeah, stay.
I'm sorry about this. We got into Bagshot and you could see a mile of
What did I
traffic
say?
around
What
the
did I say?
corner. Who knows how long it was? So I come by the motorway, which is a long way round.
Yeah,
We guessed suddenly it dawned on us, you know, that we're going to come from Mascot and we're going to hit that traffic.
Yeah.
So I'm really sorry about that.
We've got to stay now, we've made the effort to get there.
I know. Are you?
What time is it?
Still
I don't have to go in 10
Oh, that's fair
minutes
enough,
anyway,
yeah.
but yes.
Is it majority would like to stay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you sure you want to, Pat?
You sure you want to?
Yes, yes, yes.
Sure that. This is Dr. Pat Morris, by the way, and his wife Mary. Okay.
So did you bring your projector?
Is she here? Projector.
Van England doesn't sound an Indian name.
No, they're British.
So was the factory in India because that was where there was a plethora of tigers and leopards and so forth?
No, the Van Ingen family, I think, came with the Dutch name from
Yeah.
South Africa
Oh,
a long,
right.
long time ago.
Yeah.
But the man we went to see, Gilbert, the youngest survivor, he was very, very cagey about talking about his family because they were very dysfunctional still, and also I suspect he didn't really know, but the details. He didn't like talking about money either,
No.
and so you know we're lucky that he began to trust us.
Yes.
My involvement with the Van Ingen story stems from the fact that I have a long-standing interest in the history of taxidermy. I'm quite familiar with their very distinctive products because they turn up in the auction houses here in Britain quite frequently. And that's because I think probably when lots of people came home from India at the time of independence, they brought these trophies home as souvenirs. And then later, a subsequent generation inherited this stuff and didn't want it, become rather unfashionable, and so they put it up for sale in the auctions. And so I'm accustomed to seeing these things, and they fetch quite good money too, and there are people who specialise in collecting Van Ingen items. But I assume the factory had packed up before the war, maybe in the 1930s or something, and I actually tried writing to the Central Library and to the Central Post Office in Mysore, asking if the firm still existed, and if so, put me in touch. But I never got a reply. And then one day I was visiting a colleague in a museum, and I saw a recent letter on his desk with Van Ingen name and address, which I quickly copied and started up a correspondence, which resulted in the first of our 5 visits to India. So it turns out that the firm was started in the 1890s by Eugene Van Ingen and continued then with his 3 sons that you see there on the left. The taller man on the right there is the eldest son, DeWitt, who basically was the manager, and he ran the whole show with a total grip on every last detail, it seems. And on the left is Botha, the middle son, who was the only one who was married, and he was less involved on a day-to-day basis. And in the middle, the youngest son, Jubert. And you see him on the bottom right there, as we know him in more recently. This is the house that was built in the 1920s, and at that time it would have been on the outskirts of Mysore in southern India, and was specially made for the family. And you'll see that it's got a very high roof in the middle there, and this apparently is a special architectural feature because in the summertime that heats up and the hot air rises and thereby draws in fresh air to keep the place ventilated. And an interesting thing, but from my point of view, even more interesting because the central corridor underneath was lined with a whole selection of their precious trophies, souvenirs of various activities in the past. And you can see here Botha's first tiger, and a very characteristic example of a Van Ingen tiger skin, with the mouth nearly closed and those concentric rings painted into the eyes. So we met Jubert, the youngest son, and he was at one time the secretary of the local pig sticking club. You see at the top there, they've been out and managed to get a tiger. And one of the trophies on the wall there in the house is a wild dog, a dhole, where it says hunted in pajamas. Found Bisselmonte, that's the house, 5:30 a.m. and then a string of the names of the dogs, and they chased it until they got it a little way away, about 20 minutes later. So obviously a fairly spectacular event. So we started our visits and met Jubert there, and you can see Hazel, his secretary. And meeting Jubert, shaking his hands, was like building a bridge into history, because this is a man who shot his first crocodile when he was 8 years old. He shot loads of things later, and he'd been fishing with viceroys and so on, and he would happily sit there telling me stories, some of them quite gruesome, over a cup of tea, and really interesting. And one of the things I asked him was, why was it that I'd seen no examples of Van Ingen bird taxidermy, only mammals? And he rather scornfully said, "We're the tiger taxidermists. We used to do 300 or 400 of them every year," which sounded like just an idle boast. But as you'll see later, it was actually true. From the back of the house, you could see across the field there the factory in the distance, and on the left, the dog pen, and on the right, the house in which Joubert lived. So the factory was only just a short walk from the house. And it was built especially for taxidermy. I don't know any other place that's got a custom-built factory for taxidermy. And at one time, it employed about 150 people. So maybe the biggest taxidermy factory in the world ever. You can see it consists of a series of parallel sheds. And built onto the front was the portico there, and at the bottom you can see a diagram of the whole site, and the portico is at the bottom of that picture, labelled number 1, and you can drive in there and shelter from the rain or the sun and walk through the door into the next place, which is labelled 2 on the diagram, and that was a kind of display room and a place where you met customers. Customers didn't normally go any further than that into the factory. And De Wet was very almost paranoid, it seems, about secrecy and people not being allowed into the factory. But I never met De Wet. He probably wouldn't have given much time to me. But Joubert, over time, loosened up, and in the end, he became a good friend and spoke about, answered all my questions quite freely. So you got these parallel sheds then, and each one was specialised for a particular purpose. And this is the central one, which opens from the back of the entrance hall, and you can see at the bottom picture there a photo taken, I think, about 1990, in which you can see De Wet sitting in his chair there, probably doing something about checking the wages or something for those workers. And in the distance there's Joubert working on a mannequin. And on the distant wall, you can see the pharyngeal teeth, which are the trophies collected from marcia fishing. All of that been cleared out, of course, by the time we got there, and the factory itself was semi-derelict and had been silent and non-functional for several years. Closed down finally in the 1990s. So each of these sheds then had its own speciality, and one of the sheds on the left-hand side, the unclean part of the factory, you can see the men sitting on the floor, scraping the skins to thin them down and make them very supple. And the bottom picture is a man doing a very necessary job, sewing up the holes made by bullets in a tiger skin.
The top left picture, you said they were sitting on the floor.
So then there's the rug making section here, part of the right-hand clean side of the factory where all the work is done is dry. And you can see at the bottom right picture making an enormous rug out of tiger skins. There's some more activities. Lots of people there, all busy at desks doing different parts of the jobs. And the bottom right, again, about 1990, a man assembling the parts for a whole mount specimen. This was apparently a display set up by DeWitt to show the appalling injuries he sometimes found in tigers. And this was put down to the problems after independence, when there were lots of guns around left over from the war. But with removal of the British system of controlling the forests, people shot things with inappropriate weapons, as they would, of course, if you're frightened of tigers or don't want leopards coming around killing your chickens or your cattle or something. You shoot with whatever you've got, and as a consequence, some of those tigers had got dreadful wounds which had partially healed, so they must have been in pain for a long time, and that was the point of making this collection, as it were, to just as a reminder of that fact. And in the foreground, you can see roughly clean skeletons. These will be covered with clay and modelled then to make the shape of a skinned animal. And from that clay-covered model, you'd make a mould, as you'll see later, from which the mannequins, which effectively line the skin in the mounted specimen. Here was another souvenir on the table there, an elephant skull, which again had suffered appallingly. There were bullet holes in that and bullets lodged in the skull, where that elephant must have been mad with pain, and probably rather a dangerous thing, which is why it then got shot properly and finished up here in the factory. As we walked around on our first visit, we saw all these sort of bits of taxidermist debris lying about. And I think this was quite an important thing, because on our very first trip, Joubert showed that pile of stuff at the top there and poked about with his walking stick. And he poked the big skull on the left and said, "Tiger." And I said, no, I think it's a lion. And he didn't argue. But he then carried on. In fact, we both carried on identifying things on the floor there without picking them up. And so I think he realised then that I knew what I was talking about. We were both genuinely interested in this. We weren't just idle tourists come for look out of curiosity, or newspaper reporters or something. We were genuinely interested, and that led us on to, as I say, a good friendship with him. This was one small part of the factory had an upstairs room, and the termites were busy eating the wood away. You could actually hear the gnawing noises, but it was a bit dodgy wandering about, not just because of the termites eating the wood, but also because there were molted snake skins here. And I was repeatedly warned about dangerous snakes in the deserted factory. You can see there where an owl has been sitting on the windowsill, and all the droppings on the floor. There's a spare elephant's foot there. Bit more of the junk lying around. But this upstairs portion was in fact the office where all the paperwork was done. And there was still some of it lying about, and I wish now that I'd collected it all rather than just a few samples. And then downstairs was the dispatch room, where the finished specimens would be gathered together, crated up and sent off to customers. And of course, if you put things into a box, nail the lid on and put it on a ship, sending it on a 6-week journey to Europe or America or something, that allows a lot of time for any injurious insects to do their job on the specimens. And so I think they used arsenic as a sort of insecticide, and that box in the foreground got a layer of this pale dust, which, as I say, I think is probably arsenic, and that was a way of making sure that specimens were protected from insects during the long journeys. Going back to the long sheds, the left-hand side, the unclean side, where all the skins were washed in these bins here, and then put into the pickling tanks. This is where the tanning process takes place, and they used a form of tanning which is actually not very good. It's been superseded, but it was called chrome tanning, and its result was to produce skins which tended to be well, they teared very, very easily, and so they're a bit sort of fragile compared with more modern tanning methods. But anyway, the skins will be pickled in these bins here, and then taken out, washed, and nearly dried before then going to the other parts of the factory to be worked upon. So this is the long shed where you saw the men sitting on the floor scraping the skins. And then the mechanical shed where all the sawing apparatus and whatnot are all there, with drive belts operating out in the open with no safety guards. I did ask Joubert, did you have many injuries? And he seemed to think it was a strange question and said no. Whether that was because they didn't have many injuries or the injuries were all to Indians and it didn't matter, I don't know. But he simply said that people needed to be careful, which is quite true, of course. Outside was a small yard where there were these discarded elephant skulls. And they're here because the odd bones and skulls and things were actually sold to a local bone merchant, and they'd be taken away and ground up for making fertilizer. But he didn't like elephant skulls because the big teeth are very hard and damaged his grinding machinery, and so they were simply dumped here. We'll come back to those later too. Then there's what I called the modelling room, which had 3 walls with glass windows, and so there was a nice diffuse light there, and that was where the modellers would work on making the clay modelled animals, putting the clay onto the skeletons we saw earlier. And on the left you can see Joubert standing by where he said a woman sat on that sort of low sill with that black pole, pummeling the clay in the hole in the ground there and breaking up clay to make it fine and malleable for the modellers to be using in the room itself. And then part of the way down the wall on one side was the armature, the wooden framework for a baby giraffe, which had obviously never been used. And looking out into the yard, you could see some of the really big moulds. I mean, these are things that are made of concrete, and the one on the right, the nearest one, is for a rhinoceros, and it would take 2 men to lift that. I mean, really hefty things. And then we were shown the mould store, and this was the sort of inner sanctum, as it were, the secret of how Van Ingen's stuff was so different and so much better than everything else. And you can see the process, and this is Joubert telling us about how these moulds were used. Lots of them, because all the different trophy animals come in different sizes, and especially tigers. And you see on the right there a tiger, and Joubert said that size number 4 was very popular. Probably wasn't very popular with the tigers, but apparently the customers liked it. But anyway, with tigers and leopards and bears, you could have mouth open and mouth closed, snarling. There are lots of different expressions possible and different sizes, so that each species had got several different moulds to cope with all that. So here's some more out in the yard, and what look like black lines on the concrete is actually a groove, so that you could put a loop of wire into the groove and then tighten it up with a pair of pliers, and that would hold the sections of the mould together whilst the next process took place. Here's some bits and pieces lying about. You can see on the left-hand picture the papier-mâché mannequin for a bear head inside the mould, which would create it. So anyway, you pick up a mould, come from the mould store there into this room where the mannequins would be made. And this was done by using thin sheets of what Joubert called straw board. It was like a thin cardboard, and it's soaked in paste, and it then of course becomes flexible, and the men doing this job would be pasting strips or sheets of this around the inside of the mould in layers. So you put a layer of this stuff on, put the mould out in the sun, and maybe later in the day it was so hot it would be dry, and you could put another layer in. And so the papier-mâché straw board mannequin would be built up in layers over a matter of a few days, and they didn't make the mannequins to match the animals that came in. So someone brings in a tiger, they don't then start to make a tiger mannequin. What they were doing was producing mannequins all the time and storing them, so there would always be immediately available. All the variety of shapes and sizes were necessary, so there'd be no hold up. As soon as you were ready to mount the skin, there would be a mannequin there already available. And so the principle is that the shape, which would be laid down inside the concrete mould, and you can see on the right-hand picture the shape, the mannequin there, to fit that leopard head, and then it would be the same one as is on the actual leopard on the left, which is mounted on this black oversized shield. Again, a very distinctive feature of Van Ingen trophies, these big black shields. And so by continually producing mannequins, you need a big store for them. And so this is where they were stored, all locked up to avoid the risk of anybody stealing them and going to sell them to a rival taxidermist somewhere else. On the left, you can see the mannequin for panther, leopard, snarling with all the grooves there, so that when the skin's put on, it can be pushed down and pinned down into the groove, so that you've got a wrinkled snout. You can also see that it's painted black, and that's diluted pitch, because of course, if you put a wet skin on one of these mannequins, it would just simply collapse, go soggy and collapse. And so it's painted with pitch there to waterproof it, and then you can put the skin on without the mannequin going soggy. The one on the right there's one with a slightly open mouth, not a big snarl, and you can see there that the jaws have been cut out from the skull and are mounted inside the shape, inside the mannequin, padded with crumpled newspaper and possibly a little bit of clay or something.
Where's the newspaper?
So here we are. This is the mannequin store. There's a bear at the top there, and probably a small cow or bison on the right, and a nilgai, I think the man's holding. I collected up a fair old sample of these because, of course, they'll never be made again, and it's interesting that this whole principle of setting up taxidermy using moulds and mannequins rather than clay and stuffing was something which the Van Ingens were doing here by about 1900 or soon afterwards, whereas in British taxidermy, most taxidermists were still doing the old business of cleaning up the skull, padding it out with soft material or clay or something, which makes a much heavier thing, and you don't get the same kind of standardized quality. So this was quite an advanced kind of technologically, it was quite an advanced method of doing things. Anyway, so here's some more storage stuff. That bin on the right there, I'm sure, was full of arsenic, and there's various interesting bits and pieces lying on the floor. And so you can imagine that the skin would be put onto the mannequin and allowed to dry, and then the job goes to the finishers. And one of the finishing touches is to fit a tongue into the trophy heads that have the mouth open. And the tongue is made of a piece of thin lead, almost semicircular, and a man would sit with a hammer and a nail, tapping away, raising all those papillae as his job all day long, and then it would be painted and inserted into the mouth. Nobody else made tongues like that. So that was, again, another distinctive feature. Other taxidermists would just use clay or papier-mâché rolled into a sort of flattened sausage to represent the tongue. But these lead tongues are very, very distinctive. And the other distinctive thing are the eyes. And at the top there you can see the eye painter, who is taking glass blanks that they brought in from Germany, which had a small black pupil, and he would then paint the back of the glass eye with the iris. And at the bottom you can see a tiger with the yellow and blue ring around the central pupil. Characteristic Van Ingen tiger. I'm not even sure real tiger eyes do look like that exactly. But even more distinctive are the leopard eyes, where you can see there's sort of radiating marks there in a sort of silvery paint around the pupil. It's really quite a delicate job, and apparently this man painted eyes all the time until he became nearly blind himself. At the bottom there you can see an Indian bison eye, quite different shaped kind of pupil. So more distinctive features. An interesting thing is, of course, that the eyes have to match. You can't have them just sort of done quickly and crudely. They've got to match. And it was obviously a very skilled job, and the eyes then become really quite a valuable product. And once again, Duet apparently was worried about these being stolen, and so every pair of eyes had a separate booking, so that you would book out a pair of eyes specifically for a particular trophy. You didn't just have a box full of them and take the nearest ones. There was a rigid control on making sure that the eyes that were painted to be a matched pair stayed as a pair and were fixed into a trophy that was designated for them. And then there were the order books. A small room at the back of the dog pen had these huge volumes here in which they recorded everything that came into the factory for about 90 years. And this is fantastic because most taxidermists don't have any records at all. But anyway, what they did was each specimen that came in would be given a number, and these would be assembled arranged in date order. So you see the underside of that leopard there, 43,307, and then the next animal, whatever it was, will be 43,308, and so on. And those numbers would go into the book, and basically in date order, and with it details of the customer and where the finished trophy would be sent in about 6 months' time. And then on the right-hand page, there'll be details of what sort of posture the animal had to have, whether the mouth was open or closed, snarling or whatever. So all that detail was recorded in the order books, except where the animal was killed in the first place. And that's a real shame because, there could have been a huge amount of really valuable information in there, which of course was commercially not important to the Van Ingens, but latterly wanting to study the changing distribution of animals. Nowadays it would be, invaluable. Anyway, that's how the order books worked, and this is the tiger that we have here.
Say that was your wife.
That was my wife there, Mary, holding the book, and she, of course, has been helping me with all this all the time. So this is the tiger head that we've had here, bought in London, actually, from an antique dealer. And on the left-hand side, you can see that's its number, 17,773, and that number is actually painted on the back of the typical oversized black shield. And underneath it says 11632, so that came into the factory on the 11th of June 1932, and it was consigned by the private secretary to His Highness the Maharaja Sahib Bahendra of Kotal. The blue D marks when the job is finished, and the D says it's been dispatched. On the opposite facing page, there's all the instructions, and it turned out that this particular job wasn't just one tiger, it was one panther skin and skull and 20 tiger skins, 3 of which were to be set up as head mounts on shields, and the rest made into a huge rug. And so another part of this bookkeeping, if you like, is again enormously important, because you've got well-educated people here who are quite cheap to employ, and so you could spare employing someone to do this kind of thing. And what happens here is that each year they make a tally of how many specimens of each species have come each month. So in the left-hand column are the months, January down to December. The first column is tigers, then panthers, then bears, and so on across there. And if you look at the tiger column, that year, 1933, they did 495 tigers. So Joubert was right. They were tiger taxidermists. It seems extraordinary. No one would believe that you could have that many tigers. They must have been made extinct if you did 495. They wouldn't get that many the next year, but they did. They kept the numbers up, as you'll see in a minute. And so this is an invaluable source of data showing the size of the business. Now, it's also quite important because these Van Ingen specimens, and indeed tigers by other taxidermists too, are actually quite valuable, especially in the American market. And they're fetching thousands of pounds. And the problem with them is that tigers are now protected by the International Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, called CITES, and any tigers that were killed after 1947 cannot be traded. If it's before 1947, then they're worth quite a lot of money, as you can see. And so one of the huge benefits of those order books is that we have access now to look up the number. If there's a full number on these animals, you can look them up in the order book and produce proof that they are pre-1947. or indeed they are post 1947, and so it's possible to validate and authenticate, if you like, the specimens that are in trade. Well, Joubert there was slightly wary about getting into too much of this kind of detail, but by the time of our first visit, he got over all that. And although we never talked much about money, he did in the end agree to us copying the order books. And so this is a huge job. We took 12,000 photographs in about 4 days. And that would have been impossible on a camera with film. But digital cameras had improved sufficiently in that time that it was possible to take digital images and download those in one room whilst you go on taking more photographs out there on the veranda. And so there you can see the setup, photographing the double page spreads with the houseboys taking turns to turn the pages. And so from the order books, we can start an analysis of the work that was being done. And here you can see the average number of jobs per week for a 70-year period. And you can see the business built up quite rapidly in the 1920s and 30s, went on quite actively there during the Second World War, and then petered out from about 1970 onwards, when conservation legislation severely hit the big game hunting fraternity, but also Kenya, 1976, passed legislation which basically banned big game hunting in Kenya, and Kenyan specimens were actually quite an important sideline for the Van Ingham factory. And of course, with the independence as well in 1947, lots of Europeans went home, as it were, and there was less call for trophies mounting to be done. So, and after about 1975, it all just fizzles out really, with the factory being kept going, doing stuff for museums mainly, and I think also to provide jobs for people who would otherwise be penniless. Then you can look at the different species, and there you are. Tigers, a third of their work, tigers. They really were tiger taxidermists. And another third were panthers, leopards, and this was their speciality. And they did lots of other things as well, as you can see. And you can see also the effect of the seasons. So that there, in the rainy season, August through to, say, November, the rainy season, the monsoon, would make travel difficult, and the tracks all muddy and so on. And in particular, also, all the vegetation would be growing very profusely at that time, and you couldn't see very much. And so it wasn't a good time to be out hunting. Whereas in the dry season, there through March through to, say, June, the roads would have dried out, and in particular, many of the trees, the deciduous, would lose their leaves, and so you could see much more easily. And of course, the animals would be forced really to congregate near water and make them more accessible. So therefore, you get more trophies at that time. And so overall, you could see here, they did 20,000 tigers and 23,000 leopards in 90 years or so. Well, this is the Maharaja's palace. They switched all the lights on Sunday evenings. And
Where was this?
in southern India, Mary.
Yeah.
And this is open to the public, but deep inside there is the trophy room, which isn't open to the public. But Jubert, of course, he can fix it. He'd pick up a phone, bark a few words down there, and off we go to see the Maharaja's trophy room. And I think there were something like a dozen tigers there, and several elephants, and the finest examples of Van Ingham work. And of course, in a darkened room like this, not subject to fading or anything. I mean, it's beautiful examples of their work. And that's we actually went to several good places to see tigers and didn't see one at all, and except in the zoo, which is where that picture was taken. But we did go to where the Maharaja used to go hunting and get his trophies from, and that's the picture on the bottom. That used to be forest, and it's not forest anymore. And so although when we talk about 20,000 tigers at the taxidermist, you think that's why they got rare. But of course, what's actually happened is that their original forest habitat is now maize fields, and humans need a lot of space, and the tigers get displaced. So we made our last visit in 2007, and here we are just arriving, and Jubert barks out some words, calls the cook, we shall have some tea. Then he wanted to show us his new Jeep, because he'd actually sold his coffee plantation to an Indian chap who basically swindled him out of everything. But anyway, he'd sold the coffee plantation, and he'd also sold the factory site. And got lots of money, and so he wanted to show us his new Jeep. We don't need a Jeep in Mysore really, but never mind, we have a new Jeep. And
so that is him walking with me?
Yes, Mary.
And who's the lady up in
That is the cook, and she's been summoned to make tea for us. So if you look out the back, the factory had been now walled off, as it were. Jubert said we couldn't go there because it belonged to someone else now, and we couldn't visit. But I knew that each day he would go for a snooze after lunch, be asleep for a couple of hours. I also knew that there was a place where the metal fence panels had blown down, and so one day we went down there, went through the hole in the fence, and were swiftly accosted by the guard. Who was looking after the place, but he also recognised me as a useful source of rupees, and so he was quite happy to let us wander about. And after a while, he got bored with wandering about with us, which was good because I could then go around the back of the factory where the mud wall, brick wall had collapsed, and I could get in. So I was determined to have a last visit. But nature was taking it back. In quite a short time, the place was getting completely revegetated. You can see there, dotted about in those two pictures, some of those elephant skulls that we saw in the yard earlier. And it was really thick stuff. And as I say, I'd been warned so many times about the snakes. I thought, should I be trying to push through this lot or not? But of course, if I didn't, I'd never get another chance. So I decided to go as far as I could, and I found the way through this lot and into the factory. Once inside, of course, you could get from one bit to the next. And there it all was, still there, and even in the clay room with the armature for the little baby giraffe, still there, still unused. And that pile of debris, which we'd looked at with Jubert on our first visit, still there, slightly rearranged, but still there. And here we are, saying goodbye to him. In 2013, he died, aged 101, in rather sad circumstances. And I'm really glad that we we did what we did when we did, because you couldn't do it now. Of course, the whole place has been cleared, and a multiplex cinema and supermarket have been built on the site. Bissell Monty is still there, the house, but subject to disputes over legacies and so forth. And so we did what we could, and we were so lucky to be able to do it in time.
Is that his wife?
That's Hazel, his secretary.
Secretary.
Yes. So here we are. We're waving goodbye to him.
It's all been demolished now, and it's a supermarket and a multiplex cinema. So Van Gogh's a bit of history. Oh, that's all right. Van Gogh's a bit of history. It's Indian history and British history now gone. Now, I was going to save this if I got some spare time at the end. Oh, no, I'll tell you the story anyway. This is just a sort of aftermath. This is a photograph, very much a photograph of its time. You could say lots and lots of things about what you see there. And this came up at auction, and the auctioneer that was selling it just saying this was the Viceroy's tiger shoe, which of course it is. But that's all he knew about it. And what you can see there is the Viceroy sitting there, and that's Lord Linlithgow. We can look him up so we know what dates this might be. On his left is his host, his Indian host here, his wife over there, and his daughters were out on holiday. And they got 5 tigers there, and they're rhinoceros. So, knowing who the man was, and having access to some of the order books, next one, we could look them up. And so over here, you probably can't read this, and I can't without my glasses, but they actually, the blue markers again, where these tigers were processed and dispatched. And there's one here for His Excellency, and there's one for Lady Anne Hope, Hope being a family name, and the daughters. So they've all got a tiger each. Next one. And here they are. It's the family home outside of beautiful, absolutely characteristic examples of Van England tiger heads. So there you are. That was a rather unusual quality.
Well done. Thank you, Pat.
Right. I'll just show you these. You can have a closer look in a minute. This is the classic way of the taxidermist to do a mounted head. It's a fox head trophy from the taxidermist in Brighton about 1890. And you'd skin it, boil the skull and clean it up, put it back in there, put in some wadding and padding and some clay and stuff and some inappropriate eyes. And you finish up with a kind of effigy of a fox. And everyone's different, of course, because the next one you do, another one person in the factory, we use different materials, packing them up, they'll all look different and they'll all look bad. The advantage of actually doing this kind of thing, using these mannequins, is that you get a uniform quality regardless of the skill of the individuals working on that specimen. And so that's the one that fits inside there. And another mould would produce the neck piece, which will be attached to that to make the neck bit. And that's like that one. This one used to be on the shield, I think. It isn't anymore, obviously. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a number on it. And this one is a snow leopard, which was actually a rug. So you can see the lead tongue, and I've cut it away at the back. You can see how the sheet of lead is embedded at the back there with some newspaper, and there's these beautifully handcrafted eyes. And yeah, snow leopard, they do quite a lot of those. These are some of the blank eyes, which will be painted up to in the end resemble one of those. So, what else did I bring in here? I was going to bring you a mould. So you can see the whole process, but it actually is rather heavy. And carrying it all through the car park, I didn't. And so if you like a bit of their literature, you can see what they did. And they specialised in doing tigers. We had to have a tiger taxidermist. So there we are. There's a strange story to tell you.
Follow that, eh? I think, before I say thanks to Pat, I think we need to say thank you to the audience first for
Yes,
sticking
thanks
with
for
us.
staying, yes.
Much appreciated. I'm sure Pat's appreciated as well. But then, of course, Bernard, who ably filled the gap for 20 minutes or so. Thank you, Pat. That was a great talk. Well, the enthusiasm was there. So it's
You'll never be able to repeat it.
it's a lovely rounded off story as well. When the owner sells and passes away, and Pat's still involved. And all that record, Pat actually gave a talk for us years ago in the Camera Club. That's why I remember specifically about him photographing all those ledgers, all those records, stuck in my mind. Beyond the rest of it. But now we can have a look at what Pat's brought in for us and make the most of it. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you.
And next week we have Peter Franklin.